You don't have a thing to. Good morning, everybody. We're going to jump right into being live right off the bat. So, thanks for joining today. Good morning, Kathy in the studio.
Good morning.
Do you have a device that you can hear? We're on. Okay. Drinking from my Faith Cast coffee cup to start the episode. Okay. This is our last episode of Are We a Christian Nation? And today I brought in that we were going to talk about the discussion of why even discuss it, why debate, why continue to have this argument about whether or not we are a Christian nation, and why does it matter today? And I think I'm going to get a little fired up, but I'm going to try not to be too. I'm going to try not to go off on tangents. I promise, Kathy. Okay. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry to everybody out there. I'm on a tangent already because, every week as I keep learning how to do this whole vlogging thing, I keep monkeying with all of the technology. And on my camera, it looks like everything's backwards. So I'm going to try not to look at my camera today because it's bugging me. But Kathy's giving me looks already. Come on, Kathy, we're having fun today. Okay, fine. She's pointing. Get into it. Just get into the debate. Okay, so let's wrap this up really quickly to where we came from today. We started this out looking all the way back on Henry VIII and what really kicked off the part of the Protestant Reformation, the breaking of the church from the breaking of the Catholic Church from the throne, the British throne. And then we get into the Reformation with Martin Luther and the snowball effect that it had. And as the British throne developed the Church of England, and then we had breakoffs from that, that all just came across the Atlantic and helped form who we are as a nation. And we saw this influence all the way through early colonial time and how local governments ran, and the power and the influence that the local clergy had, and how that influenced all the way into our Revolutionary War and the writing of our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and most predominantly the First Amendment, that the government shall make no law infringing on the freedom of religion. It should know. And that's where we're at today. And I want to look at just a few court cases over the history of the last couple hundred years of our nation and realize how much Christian influence played into it, and really what it means for us today, especially those of us who proclaim to be followers of Jesus Christ. Because at the end of that, that's where I'm going with all of this. I haven't lied about that from the very beginning. I said right from the beginning, I am a Christian. I will argue from the standpoint of that we are influenced as a nation. We are highly, highly influenced by our Christian heritage. But I also say emphatically, we are not a Christian nation. We are not a church state. You are not forced to follow Christianity just because you live in the United States. So the first case I want to bring up, 1879, Reynolds versus the U.S. Now, this is really interesting because George Reynolds was a secretary to Brigham Young. So we are talking about the Mormon Church and the idea of polygamy, that in the Mormon Church, part of their religious view is that men are supposed to have multiple wives. And there was a law written against it, that you could not have multiple wives in the United States. It was illegal. Polygamy is illegal. Okay. And so George Reynolds was arrested for having multiple wives. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And really, I mean, it's a really, really fascinating brief to read, because the court brief went all the way back to looking at how we as a society ran all the way back to King James the First. So they went all the way back into British history, looking at the idea of does the Christian, because this is so hard to explain without getting into and feel like I'm going to start insulting Mormons, and I don't mean to. I'm just, as I say every week on here, I'm just bringing up fact and history. This is the way it was. So the court at the time looked at the idea that in a Christian faith, and they looked at the Mormon as basically a sect of the Christian faith because the Mormons proclaim Jesus Christ, that there was never any religious standing ever in Western culture that multiple wives was okay within a faith. In fact, and this is really interesting because we're going to go back to John Adams from a week ago, which is fine because then I get to correct something I said last week. And I knew I said it wrong last week and it's been bugging me all week. So this week I get to correct myself. Is they even compared it to saying that the only nations in history that had multiple wives were those from the African nations, and they were pointing specifically to the Muslim faith, which this is where I go back to last week. Remember, you know what, less than 100 years before this court ruling, we were in the Barbary Wars. And this is when I talked about John Adams as our second president, who said, we are not a Christian nation. And he was referring to the fact that we are not fighting as a Christian, as a church state. We are not fighting against other nations. We had nothing to do with the Crusades. We weren't part of that. And that's what he was trying to tell the Muslim nations. But early on, right, the Muslim world saw us as a Christian nation, and they wanted to fight against us. And so here we are almost 100 years later, and in our Supreme Court, they specifically bring it up and go, we're not like the Muslim nations. We don't have multiple wives. That's not in our faith. That's not in our standing. That is not our tradition. I mean, they blatantly lay down, here we are as a Christian faith, and as Mormons, as Latter-day Saints, you are proclaiming an idea of Christianity. No, you can't just say that you have this idea of, you know, you can pull what you want to do from society. And this is really interesting for me as a pastor, because you can't just take part of Scripture and then rewrite it or reinterpret it differently than it's ever been and go, well, this is the way it is now. Our courts actually looked at that and went, you can't do that. Like, that's not the way it's always been. You can't just suddenly say that's the way it is, because that's how you want to live your life and try to hide behind freedom of religion as it. And that's basically what they were saying. And they even quote Thomas Jefferson. But this is one thing I want to correct from last week, because I was talking about John Adams and the fact that he was actually a pretty good president, but he gets a lot of guff, especially today. And this sort of plays in today, because last week I just had a brain cramp and the name completely escaped me. I have trouble with names sometimes. If I don't write it down, I'll just get going. And I blurted out Andrew Jackson. I went, oh, wait, that's the wrong time period. It's the wrong point in history. And I was trying to say, and I still don't have it written down this week, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, which I bring up because, right, there's a big Broadway play about Hamilton now. And people look at him as, oh my gosh, he was like the greatest founding father ever, because he wrote the Federalist Papers and he had this idea of huge federal government, which Thomas Jefferson argued against. I'm sorry, Alexander Hamilton was not an incredibly that great. I mean, we should not be putting him on this sort of a pedestal. He was playing politics for his own financial gain. That's why he wanted to have a stronger federal government and weaken the states, even though most of the founding fathers said, no, we need to have more strength in the states. And if we had that, if that had been clearly defined without the politics playing of the day, we wouldn't be having as many arguments today that we are having between state power and federal power. In fact, and this is what I want to say, Alexander Hamilton, everybody wants to go, oh, what a great, moral, upright guy. He was always looking at all this stuff. He came up with an absolute hideous lie about John Adams during the election. And I thought about that because everything that's going on in our last two elections, that there was Russian collusion, and now this, was there voter fraud, and we bring all this stuff up. Alexander Hamilton started this rumor, and he had a lot of influence. He wrote the Federalist Papers. He had this idea of pushing, well, he helped with the Federalist Papers. So he had this influence in all these different areas, and he came up with this rumor that John Adams, who was very devout to his wife Abigail, I mean, there's a lot of history on that he was having two affairs, one with a French lady and one with a German lady. And then he took it even further. Talk about influencing local politics and local people, which you should think about when you watch the news and watch what you're listening to in the news today, if you're only getting it from one source. He even took this rumor farther to say that John Adams had discarded the German mistress in favor of the French mistress. Why? Because most of Pennsylvania was German at the time, and they were all insulted that John Adams would give up on a German woman. Not that he was having the affair to begin with, but that he and that is why he lost Pennsylvania. Talk about dirty politics, right? Kathy's just sitting over here laughing. So we have this idea of the power of the federal government to the state government, and this sort of matters because we're talking about the Mormons who, basically have Utah. And at the time, Utah is this huge state. I mean, it's a huge territory, which the federal government just keeps whittling away at. But that will take me way off on a tangent. It's a really fascinating tangent, but I promise I won't do it today. So they also quote in the brief, they talk about Thomas Jefferson talking about the wall of separation between church and state, which in the comments, if anybody with more of a legal understanding wanted to comment on this in a rewatch, I know you can't comment during the live stream, but what they quoted on Thomas Jefferson, he was talking about the difference between the Church of Connecticut and a Baptist church. He was actually writing a letter to the Baptist church in Connecticut saying, look, you don't have to worry about your religious freedom. The government cannot make a law saying that you have to follow the Church of Connecticut. And in the midst of this whole little letter that Jefferson writes, they use that in the brief of this wall of separation in the idea that you can't hide behind made up religious things and think that you can just ignore law. You can't break the law for federal reasons. In 1990, this goes a little further, and the courts, in fact, Justice Scalia writes the majority opinion on this. In 1990, it was the Employment Division versus Smith, and it was a Native American church. They smoked peyote, right? Which is it's a hallucinogen. It's a hallucinogen. I can't say it. And part of me had trouble with this because the guy that gets arrested, because in the state of Oregon in 1990, it is illegal to smoke peyote. The guy who gets arrested, or he doesn't get arrested, he gets fired. That's what the whole thing happens. He actually gets fired, and then his unemployment compensation is denied because the reason he was fired was because he was smoking peyote, which was illegal. The one problem I had with this is the guy worked as a counselor in a substance abuse facility. So you would think, just from a moral standard, you wouldn't be doing that. However, the Supreme Court upholds the unemployment compensation, saying, yeah, you broke the law. And Scalia writes this saying, look, it's a neutral law. It's not going after any religion, which is really interesting because all the way back into the 1879 case of Reynolds as the Mormon, that law of not having multiple wives was written specifically to attack the Mormon church. And because they were the only culture in the United States at that time with multiple. So now Scalia in 1990 writes this thing saying, look, if it's a neutral law, you can't just break the law. I mean, a law is a law. It wasn't a law written to attack your freedom of religion. It was a law based on a larger idea. And if that's a little confusing for today, I want you to think about right now as I'm talking about this. If you watch this in future months or years, you got to right now it is December of 2020. We are online with our church because the government has shut down church services. And it's not an attack on churches. It's not an attack on freedom of religion. It is a neutral, it's not even a law, it's a neutral proclamation by our governors for the betterment of society right now, for the protection of all. It is, I'd like to say it's a neutral order, but the problem is it's not, because certain businesses and organizations are allowed to stay open if they are deemed essential. But our court cannot say that church is essential, but they could. Gets a little confusing, doesn't it? So back to employment division versus Smith in Oregon. So the guy doesn't get his unemployment compensation, but the court is really, really careful, although it changes its opinion based on who's on the Supreme Court. In 1971, there was a case called Yoder versus Wisconsin, which basically said the government cannot force the Amish community to have their children have education beyond the 8th grade, because of a long-standing religious understanding of where, and right, they take that all the way back to the Reformation. I mean, the Amish sect goes all the way back to early Germany. We're talking Martin Luther, around for centuries. It's always been that way. The court can't suddenly just come in and change it and say, and what they said was parents always have the primary obligation to educate their children, which is why we have the legality of homeschooling and cyberschooling today. And well, now schools are shut down, so parents have a lot of responsibility in educating their children. Now, I want to bring up two last cases. I want to talk about a lot more. I mean, there's some really, really interesting cases which changed the landscape of our idea of freedom of religion and the separation of church and state and what it means for Christians today. And I just want to talk about two to bring this whole rambling thought together. I mean, the reason I brought up these other ones was to say, look, in the early days, there was no sense of, well, we need to separate society from Christian beliefs. The first case in 1879 of Reynolds versus the U.S. was basically protecting Christian moral standards, only because, not specifically to deem that everybody had to follow Christian standards, but that was the moral standard of our society, which stemmed from Christian beliefs. That makes sense? Our moral standard all the way up into the early 20th century was based on hundreds of years of Christian moral standard. Does that mean that Christians always got it right and we did everything right? No. But by and large, where we went as a nation was where Christian morals pushed us. And we can look at that in the ending of slavery. Nothing bugs me more than to say that all white men are to blame for slavery when before the writing of our Constitution, there were religious organizations. I brought this up in early arguments. The Quakers vehemently said slavery is wrong. All men are created equal. Christian faith was pushing to say all men are created equal, and they embraced, the African American community into that. And that holds so true. If you think I'm wrong on that and you just want a history lesson, if you're in the North or you're somewhere out in the liberal West or Northeast United States, get in your car and spend about 2 weeks just driving through the rural South and tell me how many black churches are so strong in their faith. Amen, Kathy? Amen. Man, you want to know how to follow Jesus Christ, go to a black church in the South, because right from the early part of our nation, Christians said, no, they are, doesn't matter what the color of their skin are, they are equal to us in the eyes of God. I hate that Christians get blamed for slavery. So here's the two cases I want to talk about because it matters today. The first one is Engel v. Vitale. It was in 1972. This was probably one of the landmark cases. This was all about prayer in school and basically said, A school official cannot pen and verbally or orally give a prayer in a Christian or in a school environment. As a pastor, I absolutely agree with that. And here's why. It is fundamentally against the idea of the First Amendment because as a school official, you are now an employee. If it's we're talking a public school here, okay? We need to distinguish that. This is a public school. As a public school official, you are now a government employee. I don't care where your paycheck's coming from. You are a government employee. Your paycheck is coming from the taxpayers. And as a government employee, you cannot take a certain populace, which would be your class or your children in your school, and by your authority, make them sit there and listen to your religious rhetoric. Even if I believe in your religious beliefs, even if I absolutely agree that, yes, more kids should understand Christian values, in the idea of our society, this is the absolute separation of church and state. If you are a government official, you cannot. Now, I could say this because Christianity, actually faith, has an interesting way to go. I mean, God is so cool because I worked for several years as a coach in public school. So as a coach, I couldn't pray. I didn't share. I mean, as a coach who was a pastor, everybody in the community knew I was a pastor, but I never talked directly about faith. Did I bring up moral standards that are seen in Christianity? Absolutely, because that's where my moral standards are from. But when it came time for if the kids wanted to pray before a game, I would always say, look, I'm stepping out of the locker room. Whatever you guys want to do right now to get yourselves ready, you guys go ahead and do it. And there were students who had very strong faith. Huge shout outs to the Kesterholt parents. Who would say, you know what, guys, I want to pray before the game. If you want to join me, that's great. As a student, he's not a government employee. He's a student. He's a private citizen who has every right by his freedom of religion and freedom of speech to pray anytime he wants to, wherever he wants to. Well, as long as it's not disrupting you know what I mean? Not disrupting some other public function. So he would go ahead and pray and the entire team would pray with him. I'd just step out of the room and let it happen. Because as a government official, I could also not step in the way of it and not let it happen. The one thing that bugs me about that as a theologian and somebody who has, advanced studies in world religions is that we have taken that idea of separation of church and state too far, and we are not teaching world religions as vehemently as we should be in our societies, in our classes, in our schools today. And it's a problem simply because kids don't have a true understanding of world ideologies. That we just want to pretend religion doesn't exist. We just won't talk about it. We won't teach it at all. And now people don't understand where a lot of cultures come from, where a lot of cultures get their ideologies, why they believe what they believe, why they do what they do. The number of people that argue about 9/11 and Muslims running planes into buildings, and that is from a religious ideology. The people that argue against, our president standing up for Israel today, when you look at the Middle East, that is religious ideology. Kids should have a deeper understanding of that. We shouldn't be putting a veil over it and the idea of separation in church and state. And that is reason one that we should argue vehemently more about the idea of religious influence on our societies, and us specifically as having so much Christian influence in our society. And the second one, I only have a few minutes left. This one is a court case that drug on from 2012 to 2018. And it was the Masterpiece Cake Shop v. Colorado. Most of you probably remember hearing about this in the news. This was the bake shop owner, the baker, that had very strong religious beliefs and felt that making a wedding cake for a gay couple violated his freedom of religion and his freedom of expression, because he had an issue with gay marriage based on his religious standing, which, when you look at all of the precedent, this is why I brought down all these other cases. When you look at the precedent, the very one, Reynolds v. U.S., where we were allowed to look at where did we come from all the way back to King James the First, it has always been in culture that gay marriage was wrong. Now, and I'm not standing here saying whether or not gay marriage is right or wrong. If I have a minute or two before I end, I'll finish up, where I stand as a pastor leading a relatively conservative church. But here's where the Supreme Court went with this. So this cake owner, if you don't know the story, the cake owner was fined. He had all these regulations put on his business, just on his business, saying that you now had to show how many cakes you made, who you made them for, and the number of times that you refused to make a cake for somebody. To the point, it was so daunting on him that he, as one individual, said, you know what, I'm just not going to make wedding cakes anymore, which almost killed his business. That was 40. Wedding cakes was 40% of his bakery business. And the government was coming down on him so hard because of his religious beliefs that it was basically destroying his livelihood. And all of the lower courts were saying on it, this is a matter of discrimination. He discriminated based on sexual orientation. He has a public service that he discriminated, and that was what it was based on. However, the Supreme Court said this is not a neutral law. Remember, I brought up the dude that smoked the peyote, right? And the precedent was set in 1990 saying, look, it's a neutral law. It affects everybody. It's just a law the way it is. And the Supreme Court, looking at this baker who was being attacked because of his religious beliefs, said this is not a neutral law. You are specifically coming up with ordinances to attack him because of his faith. And you're not applying it across the board. You're not going to every other baker and having them have all of these standards that they now have to file paperwork and they have to. You are taking somebody because of his religious beliefs and attacking him and essentially trying to destroy his life. You cannot do that. And all of the justices agreed on. I mean, when they looked at it in the bigger sense of this and didn't look at it in the idea of discrimination, and the idea of basically saying, look, as a gay couple, they are not being discriminated on in the sense of society. There's no law discriminating on them. They can go to anybody else and get a cake made. This man is holding firm to his belief across the board, and you can't pick and choose like that. You can't. And the only person who dissented on that, actually, I think there were two dissent. It was a 7-2 vote, but the big dissenter on that was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, she's in the very liberal end of our society right now, is heralded as this great savior of society. God bless her for the work she did do, but I'm okay with her not being on the Supreme Court anymore. May she rest in peace. But she was, and this is why, she was not a true constitutionalist. She was a society influencer. And basically, she would go along with she would go along with her own personal beliefs of where she felt that society should be. And she wrote that in certain briefs in the big picture. And I know, man, I'm going to get some guff on this. People are going to argue about it, but that's who she was. And people on the Supreme Court should be constitutionalists. They should be totally separated from the views of whatever is popular in the day in society. That's not their job. That's what legislation is about. And in fact, going back to the 1990 case on the Oregon ban on smoking peyote, that is actually what the Supreme Court said to Smith, who was the one that lost his job, was basically, you need to take this back to legislation to say that there should be in the legislature exemptions for people for religious reasons. And they even cited certain states that had that very specifically about peyote. to protect the Native Americans, but said it's not our job to make policy. It's not our job to write rules. It's not our job to, right? That is not the job of the Supreme Court. And so we have all of these cases that have funneled down through and has now brought in this idea of where do we stand now as a nation with Christian values? We are not a church state. You are not forced to follow Christianity because you live in the United States. That's what it means by separation of church and state. Separation of church and state does not mean that your moral standards, if they come from Christian values, are irrelevant. And the problem today is that's where a lot of people want to be. That's what a lot of people want to say. That's where the push is. We saw that with, and this is why I sort of push back on, I know I'm a couple minutes late. I don't care today. Sorry, Kathy's giving me she's my producer over there going, wrap it up. But I want to finish this really quick. That's why I push back on Ruth Bader Ginsburg a little bit, because as long as she's pushing public sentiment in her opinions without looking at specifically constitutional law, everybody who wants to shout out about, well, that's a good public opinion, that's okay, that's wrong. Because our Supreme Court is not about public opinion, but the Justice Barrett, who was just brought on the Supreme Court, everybody was screaming that she should not be on the Supreme Court because she's a practicing Catholic. And when I say everybody, I'm saying everybody that doesn't want to have the sense that the Supreme Court will be conservative or ultra conservative, as I've heard some people who think they know judicial understanding a little. I love people who get on Facebook and they write a post and suddenly they have, a law degree from Yale. So let me wrap this up because I knew I was going to run out of time. In the first 150 so years of our courts, of our nation, there really are no court cases that say Christianity is irrelevant. In fact, in those cases, it's an idea of freedom of expression and Christian values were actually defended. And it's been since the 1940s, and I brought this up in an early issue, but since about the 1940s that we've started to have more and more of these court cases where that's being flipped on its head, where anything that is brought up as a Christian value is wrong for our society and needs to be eliminated. And that's wrong. That's not who we are as a society. We have a freedom of religion, and part of our freedom of religion is to be able to live our lives around us living by those moral standards. And if you disagree with those moral standards, then you can go live your life how you want to live it, but you cannot take your lack or differing moral standards and tell Christians they must give up their moral standards for us to have unity in the nation. That's not how it works. There has to be a way for us to live in harmony with our differences. And I will close with this last thought as I finish up this entire series. If you are watching this, you made it all the way to the end of all of this series, and you're watching this last episode, if you are offended, if you are put off by Christian values that go against the world you're living in, and you want to attack or belittle or diminish those of the Christian faith to try to make yourself feel better, I would ask you to think about, is it really the world around you that's got off course, or is it something in your own heart? Because most of the time when we're being corrected in our lives, if we feel like we're being corrected in our lives, and we want to lash out at the person correcting us, I do it to Kathy sometimes, and she gets on me for not picking up my clothes, and I want to be like, I'm a grown man. If I don't want it, really, it's my own guilt of going, I live here with her. I really need to pick up after myself. I need to take responsibility for it. And I would argue that the majority of the time that people want to argue that we are not a Christian nation because you don't want Christian values and morals still to be seen in this society is simply because there's something in your own life that you either don't want to try to actually mature out of or bring your life into you don't want to hold yourself responsible for something. And if I were to argue anybody one-on-one with the idea of whether or not we are a Christian nation, I have to believe that if the debate went long enough, it would come down to what is it in your life that you're struggling with and you're trying to justify. So that's why every Christian in the nation today needs to continue to defend that we were founded on the principles of God's teaching to us through Jesus Christ to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Amen. Sorry, I preached a little bit today, but that's it for the series. Next week, we're going to go into something new. I have a feeling I'm going to be talking about the coronavirus a little bit, just because I can. And I think I'm going to be putting out an additional podcast in response to another YouTuber that I've seen he's basically a Christian who likes to have a podcast attacking Christians. And I feel like someone needs to hold him accountable a little bit without putting a plank in my own eye. So watch out for that. And with that, we will be online with our church service at 11 a.m. And that's it. You guys all have a fantastic, fantastic week. And prayerfully, we'll be back up the Grange Hall soon with our church services. Merry Christmas, everybody.